In the summer of 1941, the German war machine surged eastward with a confidence forged in the lightning victories of Poland, the Low Countries, and France. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, was conceived as a swift and decisive campaign. Adolf Hitler and his generals believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months, its vast territories yielding food, oil, and raw materials to sustain the Reich's expanding empire. Yet in this alternate unfolding of history, the Soviet leadership responded with a brutal clarity of purpose that reshaped the course of the war almost from the very beginning. The German plan rested upon speed. 3 massive army groups, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, struck deep into Soviet territory on June 22, 1941. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad, Army Group Center drove directly toward Moscow, and Army Group South pushed into the fertile lands of Ukraine. German commanders assumed that the vast agricultural wealth of the Soviet Union would soon feed their armies, while captured fuel supplies would power the relentless advance of their armored divisions. But in this altered reality, the Soviet High Command recognized with greater urgency the existential nature of the invasion. Joseph Stalin, shaken but resolute, abandoned any lingering hesitation about destroying the resources of his own land. Orders were issued with uncompromising severity. As the Red Army withdrew before the advancing Wehrmacht, everything of potential use to the invader was to vanish. Rail lines were dismantled, bridges collapsed into rivers. Warehouses were burned until their flames blackened the horizon. Crops standing in the fields were cut down or set alight before the German columns could reach them. Livestock was driven eastward in massive herds, or slaughtered where it stood. Fuel depots were emptied, their contents either transported beyond the reach of the invaders or destroyed in towering infernos. The scale of the devastation surpassed anything the German planners had anticipated. Villages along the invasion routes were evacuated with ruthless efficiency. Entire regions became silent corridors of abandonment, where only smoldering ruins and empty wells greeted the advancing troops. Soviet engineers moved with the retreating front, demolishing infrastructure methodically, ensuring that little remained intact behind them. At first, the Wehrmacht continued its advance with the momentum of previous campaigns. Soviet formations collapsed in great encirclements, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken in the early months of the invasion. Yet as German columns pressed deeper into the Soviet interior, an unexpected problem began to emerge. The land offered nothing. German supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back toward Poland, already strained by the vast distances of the Eastern Front. In the historical campaign, German units had expected to supplement their provisions by seizing Soviet food stocks and fuel depots along the way. In this alternate scenario, those expectations dissolved almost immediately. Truck convoys arrived at abandoned villages only to find empty storehouses and scorched fields. Wells were poisoned or filled with rubble. Grain silos smoldered in the aftermath of deliberate fires. Fuel tanks lay shattered, their contents spilled into the soil or ignited long before German forces arrived. The consequences unfolded gradually but relentlessly. Panzer divisions that had once raced forward at breathtaking speed began to slow. As fuel allocations tightened, motorized infantry units found their trucks rationed and immobilized. Horses, still the backbone of much of the German logistical system, struggled to find fodder in landscapes where crops had been deliberately destroyed. By late summer, German commanders faced a growing logistical crisis. The supply columns that fed the advancing armies had to travel farther than ever before. While roads deteriorated under the constant movement of vehicles and artillery, Soviet demolition units targeted railways with particular precision, ensuring that captured lines could not be restored quickly enough. To support the advancing front, the Red Army, though battered, found an unexpected ally in the empty vastness left behind. Soviet units retreating eastward no longer left behind supplies that might strengthen the invader. Instead, the German army was forced to consume its own reserves at a pace far exceeding pre-war calculations. The effect was especially severe. In the southern sector of the front, Army Group South had expected Ukraine to provide abundant grain and livestock to support both the army and the German homeland. Instead, German soldiers encountered farmland stripped bare. Soviet authorities had driven livestock eastward across the steppe in enormous migrations, leaving behind only desolate pastures. Food shortages soon became an undeniable reality. Rations were reduced, and soldiers were forced to rely more heavily on supplies transported from distant depots in occupied Poland. Yet the rail network struggled to keep pace with the demands of a front that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Fuel proved even more critical. Panzer divisions, the spearhead of German strategy, depended upon a constant flow of gasoline. Without it, the doctrine of rapid maneuver warfare could not function. As the months passed, fuel shortages forced commanders to make difficult choices about where to concentrate their remaining mobility. Some offensives slowed or halted entirely as logistical planners scrambled to redistribute dwindling reserves. Armored units that might once have driven forward with relentless speed now paused frequently, waiting for fuel convoys that often arrived late or not at all. Meanwhile, Soviet industry, already in the midst of a massive relocation effort, continued to move eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Factories dismantled piece by piece were reassembled in distant regions, far from the reach of German bombers. The destruction of Western infrastructure, painful though it was, bought the Soviet Union precious time. Autumn approached with unsettling implications for both sides. The German army had not yet delivered the decisive blow that Hitler had promised. Moscow still stood, and Soviet resistance remained stubborn and determined. But in this alternate campaign, the logistical exhaustion of the German army arrived earlier than in recorded history. The advancing formations had consumed enormous quantities of fuel and supplies simply reaching the depths of Soviet territory, while gaining almost nothing from the land itself. The Red Army, though still retreating in many sectors, began to stabilize defensive lines. Earlier than expected, Soviet commanders exploited the slowing pace of the German advance, concentrating reserves and launching localized counterattacks designed not to destroy the Wehrmacht outright but to bleed its dwindling resources. German soldiers began to sense the shift. The promise of quick victory faded into uncertainty. Endless columns of vehicles sat idle beside dusty roads, their fuel tanks nearly empty. Supply officers calculated ration reductions with growing anxiety. What had been envisioned as a short and triumphant campaign now threatened to become a war of endurance fought across a continent deliberately stripped of sustenance. Winter loomed on the horizon. In the historical timeline, the German army arrived before Moscow, exhausted but still capable of mounting a final effort. In this alternate reality, the strain of the scorched earth strategy had already eroded the Wehrmacht's operational strength months earlier. The vast spaces of the Soviet Union had always been a formidable obstacle. Now those spaces had been transformed into a weapon deliberately wielded by the defenders. Every burned field and demolished rail line forced the invader to depend solely upon the fragile thread of its own supply system. The German army had conquered territory at astonishing speed. Yet conquest alone no longer guaranteed survival. The deeper the Wehrmacht advanced, the more tenuous its position became. Thus the campaign of 1941 began to reveal a new and sobering truth. Blitzkrieg, the doctrine that had shattered Europe, relied not only on speed and surprise, but also on the assumption that the conquered land would sustain the conqueror. On the scorched plains of the Soviet Union, that assumption had been systematically destroyed. What remained was a vast battlefield stripped bare, where distance, hunger, and dwindling fuel threatened to halt the most formidable military machine the world had yet seen.
Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into alternate history fascinating,